Welcome to episode 49 of the Henry George Daily Devotional. We are in Book 4, which I guess is the effect of material progress upon the distribution of wealth. We will be reading chapter 1, the dynamics of the problem yet to seek. We have a nice quote we'll start with as well. I guess we'll read all of chapter 1. And that's it for today. We're keeping it nice and tight. Chapter 2 is the effect of increased population upon the distribution of wealth. Chapter 3, the effect of improvements in the arts upon the distribution of wealth. Chapter 4, the effect of the expectation raised by material progress. John Stuart Mill says, "Hitherto it is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being." Take that, techno-optimists, and shove it up your mechanical cyborg implant input jack. Mrs. Browning says, "Do ye hear the children weeping, O my brothers, ere the sorrow comes with years? They are leaning their young heads against their mothers that cannot stop their tears. The young lamb are bleating in the meadows, the young birds are chirping in the nest. The young fawns are playing with the shadows, the young flowers are blowing toward the west. But the young children, O my brothers, they are weeping bitterly. They are weeping in the playtime of the others, in the country of the free." Poet Mrs. Browning. English poet of the Victorian era. She died 1861. This was published 1879. Here we go. Chapter 1, the dynamics of the problem yet to seek. George writes, "In identifying rent as the receiver of the increased production which material progress gives, but which labor fails to obtain, in seeing that the antagonism of interests is not between," this is interests not meaning the return to capital, "in seeing that the antagonism of interests is not between labor and capital, as is popularly believed, but is in reality between labor and capital on the one side, because capital is just stored up labor, and land ownership on the other, we have reached a conclusion that has most important practical bearings, but it is not worth while to dwell on them now, for we have not yet fully solved the problem which was at the outset proposed." Okay. To say that wages remain low because rent advances is like saying that a steamboat moves because its wheels turn round. The further question is, what causes rent to advance? What is the force or necessity that, as productive power increases, distributes a greater and greater proportion of the produce as rent? The only cause pointed out by Ricardo as advancing rent is the increase of population, which, by requiring larger supplies of food, necessitates the extension of cultivation to inferior lands, or to points of inferior production on the same lands, and in current works of other authors attention is so exclusively directed to the extension of production from superior to inferior lands as the cause of advancing rents that Mr. Carey, followed by Professor Perry and others, has imagined that he has overthrown the Ricardian theory of rent by denying that the progress of agriculture is from better to worse lands. Alright, so apparently there was some prevalent view about rent going up as more and more people were born and you had to make more food. We have a large footnote to read. George writes this footnote saying, "As to this, it may be worthwhile to say, 1. That the general fact, as shown by the progress of agriculture in the newer states of the Union, and by the character of the land left out of cultivation in the older, is that the course of cultivation is from the better to the worse qualities of land. 2. That matches my intuition. I was a little surprised to hear that Carey and others tried to overthrow this by denying that agriculture doesn't go from better to worse. But anyway, George continues with his second point. 2. That whether the course of production be from the absolutely better to the absolutely worse lands, or the reverse, and there is much to indicate that better or worse in this connection merely relates to our knowledge. Yes, reminds me of the video game Civilization, where you don't know. You at first you can only sow seeds or hunt animals, and then you later you discover, oh, actually iron is pretty important. So land that you had previously not cared about because it didn't have any food on it, and it didn't like animals to hunt, and it didn't have good soil for farming. But then you discover that there's iron there. Hot diggity dog. Of course, then way later when you start finding lithium, like we have now found in Nevada, we're crazy about lithium. And who knows what we're going to care about in the future. Anyway, so that makes sense when George says this in connection to our knowledge, and that future advances may discover compensating qualities in portions of the earth now esteemed most sterile. That's curious. What has lithium been used for in the past? As a treatment for gout in George's time. It looks like that might be about it. Well, other diseases, bunch of diseases. But this is just lithium as medication. We could look at lithium in general. All right, well, you can do that on your own time, I suppose. And I can do that on my own time, I suppose. George continues. May discover competent cause of person now esteemed most sterile. It is always, and from the nature of the human mind, must always tend to be, from land under existing conditions deemed better, to land under existing conditions deemed worse. Point 3. That Ricardo's law of rent does not depend upon the direction of the extension of cultivation, but upon the proposition, hello, Miguel, but upon the proposition that if a land of certain quality will yield something, land of a better quality will yield more. Grumble of Pug says, Max, we heard you have the answers. How do we solve the world's problems? We solve the world's problems. At least we start solving the world's problems by implementing land use reform. Yes, I do have the solution to all of humanity's problems. Yes. Wow, there's just so many people. I suspect I got raided, but using Restream.io doesn't really notify me of this. It's still reporting that I have one viewer, mysteriously. So I'm guessing Jotson raided me, for whom I am doing all of these recordings. Jotson, it's time. It's yes, I was right with 76 viewers. Well, here I'll trust you. I have a great faith in you, Javi. According to Restream, I have one viewer. You guys are, spoiler alert, have you seen Three Body Problem? Perhaps you're all just one Sophon flittering around, embodying 76 viewers. Anyway, welcome 76 viewers. I am reading from Progress and Poverty. It is the seminal work by Henry George. Henry George being the guys whose ideas went on to inspire the board game Monopoly. I sort of came to believe in George because I had already started joking around that I felt like I was living on a Monopoly board that was already owned. And then I went and read this article about Henry George and his ideas leading to the creation of the board game Monopoly. I thought that was hilarious and intriguing. And then I went on to read that he argues that the monopolization of land is the largest cause of injustice in our society, and probably the largest factor that retards our progress and our ability to fairly distribute our production to all members of society. And he while he advocates for a taxation on land, And for the view that we all own the land, he he believes that everyone owns the produce of their labor. So he is not a socialist, because I've always believed very much in free markets and in price signaling and in freedom. I don't want a central government telling me what to do, where to do it, whom to do it with. You know, you get it. I'm an American. Anyway, if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about them. I am very passionate about this. I learned about Georgism a couple years ago, and now I talk to everyone about it. Uh, and I may be becoming more of an activist. All right, we will go back to George. Um, yeah, it's very tempting to. I don't know if anyone asks questions, I will answer them. But otherwise, I guess I'll just continue. George continues, item number 3 in his footnote, that Ricardo's law of rent does not depend upon the direction of the extension of cultivation, but upon the proposition that land will yield. I think I already read this. Land of better quality will yield more. Hello, Justin. That was this footnote. I guess in a brief summary, George has established. You may not agree if you read the work and don't think his reasoning or his premises were acceptable. But if you're with him so far, we would have agreed that the land owners, um, as production goes, it becomes more efficient as we either work more and more with more technological progress, or as other lands are found to be useful, that the landlords are able to increase rent, and so all of the non-land owning people, the laborers, and people who even own capital but do not own land, they're not able to gain more of the share of the wealth that is being produced, because the landowner, they effectively have a monopoly and can forcibly raise rent. Um, and we're trying to figure out why they, I guess, are. I guess I kind of just spoiled it. They have a land monopoly uh, that's granted by the way our society treats land. But that's sort of what George is driving at here. He continues. Now, while it is unquestionably true that the increasing pressure of population, which compels a resort to inferior points of production, will raise rents, and does raise rents, I do not think that all the deductions commonly made from this principle are valid, nor yet that it fully accounts for the increase of rent as material progress goes on. This was also written in 1879. It's an old book. There are evidently other causes which conspire to raise rent, but which seem to have been wholly or partially bidden by the erroneous views as to the functions of capital and genesis of wages which have been current. To see what these are and how they operate, let us trace the effect of material progress upon the distribution of wealth. The changes which constitute or contribute to material progress are 3. 1. Increase in population. 2. Improvements in the arts of production and exchange. And 3. Improvements in knowledge, education, government, police, manners, and morals, so far as they increase the power of producing wealth. Material progress, as commonly understood, consists of these 3 elements in directions of progression, in all of which the progressive nations have for some time past been advancing, though in different degrees. As considered in the light of material forces or economies, the increase of knowledge, the betterment of government, etc., have the same effect as improvements in the arts. It will not be necessary in this view to consider them separately. What bearing intellectual or moral progress merely as such has upon our problem we may hereafter consider. And this is a part I haven't really talked too much about to my friends, but that is something he talks about much later. spoiler alert, it's something like our capacity to be virtuous is directly linked to how much money we got in the bank. It's a lot easier to be kind and generous and support other causes in the world when you yourself are financially secure. You know, when well, yeah, like it's still a struggle for me if I'm gonna buy free range chicken or and eggs from free range hens, or if I buy the cheap choice. Who knows? Anyway, that's he says we'll talk about that later. George says, we are at present dealing with material progress to which these things contribute only as they increase wealth producing power, and shall see their effects when we see the effect of improvements in the arts. Uh, while I do agree with George on a lot of things he talks about other than the land issue, uh, the novelty and the high value I place on him is because of his land value ideas. George continues. To ascertain the effects of material progress upon the distribution of wealth, let us therefore consider the effects of increase of population apart from improvement in the arts, and then the effect of improvement in the arts apart from increase of population. We will isolate each of these. Okay. Table Cat asks, does that mean that moral bankruptcy can be said to be tied to financial bankruptcy? I think George would say there is definitely a link. Although I would suspect he would not say it is wholly dependent upon that. Since I have 30 viewers now that Restream has updated, I will continue for chapter 2. I do enjoy it so. Chapter 2, the effect of increase of population upon the distribution of wealth. All right, we're going to deal with this one, and then we'll get to the other. The manner in which increasing population advances rent, as explained and illustrated in current treatises, is that the increased demand for subsistence forces production to inferior soil or to inferior productive points. Thus, if with a given population, the margin of cultivation here means with the plot of land that's like sort of outside of society that no one's using that can be used for free without having to rent from a landlord is the line. Sometimes I get confused. Is it the piece of land that is being used by somebody that is the worst piece of land, or is it the piece of land that no one that is available to anyone to go start using because it is the worst land? But anyway, he's going to say the margin of cultivation is at 30. So there's this piece of land that no one's using. That's where I'm going to treat margin of is, and you can get 30 units of wealth from it. So all lands of productive power over 30 will pay rent. So if you have a piece of land that makes 35, then if you want to pay someone to come work it, you only need to really pay them 30 because that's the best they can do working somewhere else. Or I guess you could pay them 30 plus, epsilon, a sliver, and then you'll be able to pocket $5, 5 units of wealth as rent. That's what this means. That's our situation. George continues, if the population be doubled, an additional supply is required which cannot be obtained without an extension of cultivation that will cause lands to yield rent that before yielded none. If the extension, this is of the margin of cultivation, be to 20, so that's like all these people get born and they start using up all this marginal land that's at 30 to the point where the next people are born, the best land they can find that's not yet claimed is now land that only produces 20 units of wealth. So then this land up here in the previous generation that somebody claimed and was cultivating for 30 units of wealth, now it generates 10 units of rent. The land between 20 and 30 will yield rent. And so since that land yields rent, that land could have a value, so it could be, effectively sold. And all land over 30 will yield increased rent and have increased value. Yes, so that other, I mentioned a hypothetical piece of land that had 35, so it had a 5 units of rent. Now, since the margin of cultivation is down to 20, that land that was producing 35 has 15 units of rent. It has gone up. It is here that the Malthusian doctrine receives from the current education's elucidations of the theory of rent the support which I spoke when enumerating the causes that have combined to give that doctrine an almost undisputed sway in current thought. So, since most of you weren't here for our discussion of Malthusian doctrine is the proposition that humans reproduce faster than they can create food. He argues that humans reproduce exponentially and that at best subsistence production, food production, increases linearly, although they use the term geometrical, which is confusing to me because when I think of a geometric series, I think of something else. But basically, the classic example that Malthus gives is he's like, suppose there's like 11 million people, and they can make they're making $11 million or whatever, 11 million portions of food for the people. In like 25 years, he says the population will double, um, and he'll suppose that in 25 years time, he says that the population will be able to produce 11 million more in food. So in 25 years, there's now double people, 22 million, but we're making 11 million more food. And so that's his premise. Every 25 years, humans will make 11 million more food, but the population will double. So in 25 more years, our population will go from 22 to 44 millions, and yet we only add 11 million food, going from 22 million food to 33 million food. So after 50 years, we have 44 million people and 33 million food. So there are 11 million people starving. And so he says that this is inevitable, that basically overpopulation is always going to be happening. That is the Malthusian doctrine. And George spends a long time debunking it and giving tons of examples. And given that it was all written in 1879 and our population is way, way bigger, and we have plenty of food, well, some people might argue we don't have plenty of food, I suppose. I think we do, it's just not well distributed. It sure seems like Malthus lost. Anyway, that's my little summary of Malthusian doctrine. Jotson says we have plenty of food with bad distribution and also with bad distribution. All right. George continues. According to the Malthusian theory, the pressure of population against subsistence becomes progressively harder as population increases. And although two hands come into the world with every new mouth, it becomes, to use the language of John Stuart Mill, this is an earlier philosopher and economist, you may have heard of him. George continues, harder and harder for the new hand. Yes, with every new mouth, it becomes harder and harder for the new hands to supply the new mouths. According to Ricardo's theory of rent, rent arises from the difference in productiveness of the lands in use, and as explained by Ricardo and the economists who have followed him, the advance in rents which experience shows accompanies increasing population is caused by the inability of procuring more food except at a greater cost, which thus forces the margin of population to lower and lower points of production, commensurately increasing rent. Yeah, that was all the stuff we worked through. As the margin of production goes down to 20, your land that was yielding no rent at 30 now yields 10 rent, increasing rent. Thus, the two theories, as I have before explained, are made to harmonize and blend. Malthusian and Ricardian. Law of rent. The law of rent becoming but a special application of the more general law propounded by Malthus, and the advance of rents with increasing population, a demonstration of its resistless operation. I refer to this incidentally because it now lies in our way to see the misapprehension which has enlisted the doctrine of rent, which, if you haven't been with us, we, George and me, we believe in the doctrine of rent, Ricardo's law of rent. We just think that the other ideas of economists have gotten screwed up, especially because of Malthusian theory. Um, which has enlisted in the support of a theory to which it in reality gives no countenance. The Malthusian theory has been already disposed of, and the cumulative disproof, which will prevent the recurrence of a lingering doubt, will be given when it is shown, further on, that the phenomena attributed to the pressure of population against subsistence would, under existing conditions, manifest themselves were population to remain stationary. All right. He's foreshadowing. This misapprehension to which I now refer. Wow, look at this paragraph. Let's gird ourselves. Um, my apprehension for this paragraph must be belayed. I don't know. The misapprehension to which I now refer, and which, to a proper understanding of the effect of increase of population upon the distribution of wealth, it is necessary to clear up, is the presumption expressed or implied in all the current reasoning upon the subject of rent in connection with population, that the recourse to lower points of production involves a smaller aggregate produce in proportion to the labor expended. Yes, this would be sort of the implied idea, is that as we are having to move to the worse and worse land, as there's more and more people born, it means that effectively the aggregate produce, the total produce relative to how much labor is expended will go down. George says, though that this is not always the case is clearly recognized in connection with agricultural improvements, which, to use the words of Mill, are considered as a partial relaxation of the bonds which confine the increase of population. Yes, so you could see how, like, if you accepted this view, you would probably be willing to say, yes, we're using worse and worse land, so proportionately the new labor's not making as much food as the old labor. But when we invent new things that lets us do things more efficiently, that is a counterforce. Sure, sure. And I think George and everyone, no one's going to dispute that technological progress literally is progress. So, um, and in that meaning, it's like, oh yes, that lets us produce more things with less effort. George continues, but it is not involved even where there is no advance in the arts, and the recourse to lower points of production is clearly the result of the increased demand of an increased population. For increased population of itself and without any advance in the arts implies an increase in the productive power of labor. The labor of 100 men, other things being equal, will produce much more than 100 times as much as the labor of one man, and the labor of 1,000 men much more than 10 times as much as the labor of 100 men. And so with every additional pair of hands which increasing population brings, there is more than proportionate addition to the productive power of labor. This is what George is going to argue for. Uh, where was I just hearing about in I'm gonna jump ahead. I'm gonna spoil a little bit. Like in some matchmaking factory, I was reading about, like, six workers, um, six workers were able to produce like 48,000 matches in a day. I don't know, in a week, in a month. I don't know, something like that. Um, you refer to this as the sandbag theory. That's interesting. I don't know how are is this like is that in the production of sandbags? Is there a huge specialization of labor maybe? Because what I'm getting to with this sand with the sorry with the match producing factory I heard about, so like it was some like a dozen or 10 people could produce 48,000 matches in some span of time. Um, and yet, if you only had one person, like it's unlikely in that same span of time that that one person would even be able to make one match because they don't even know how to do the other people's jobs. And even if you train them to do it all, maybe they would be able to make, you know, a dozen matches or something. Okay, here, yeah, I think you're expressing is that fill a sandbag by yourself or do it with two people. Okay, yes. Who's gonna hold the sandbag open? Yes, this is miserable. You see, you see this I have this PVC pipe structure behind me that I use. You don't really need it so bad today, but when it's sunny, it blocks the sun. Uh, I accidentally, it's a very frail, badly made PVC pipe structure, and I bump into it and it collapses. And then setting it back up by myself is quite a hassle because it's big and you jam the joints in over on one side and then they dangle on the other side and it it takes me like 10 minutes to rebuild it. Whereas with two people, we could do it in like 1 minute. So yes, the division of labor. However, and I think George is going to say this, both effects are happening. As there's more and more people, you often do need to move to worse and worse land, and so there is a kind of a decrease in the effect of that labor naively. It is then compensated for by the division of labor, specialization of labor. Um, yeah. So, anyway, George continues. Thus, with an increasing population, and then, like, I don't know, when I hear this from George, you can always be like, well, there's a, you know, say we're making a sandbag, right? We can do it pretty well with two people, right? But with three people, does that help us much? Four people? No, doesn't really help us much. It would, at some point you could have you get these weird jumps, right? So two people or one person really slow, two people fast, three people not much better, four people now you can break into teams of two. So then you get that kind of pattern, six people, eight people, 10 people. But then once you get maybe to 1,000 people or something, then like okay now at some point like let's just build a big factory, right? And then you know then you can get that kind of there are these weird jumps in it. Like I'm trying to program a video game. If I had somebody helping me, it could go a lot better. But if we had 10,000 people all working on my one video game, it probably wouldn't go any faster than me working by myself. Unless you just were to take 9,500 people from that 10,000 and tell them to just like go door to door knocking on doors promoting the game and then only use 500 people to actually produce a game. So you get these weird, at least this is what comes to my mind, these weird equilibrium points. I don't know. Anyway, enough from me. Back to George. Um, yes. With every additional pair of hands, um, And so, with every additional pair of hands which increasing population brings, there is a more than proportionate addition to the productive power of labor. Thus, with an increasing population, there may be a recourse to lower natural powers of production, not only without any diminution in the average production of wealth as compared to labor, but without any diminution at the lowest point. If population be doubled, land of but 20 productiveness may yield to the same amount of labor as much as land of 30 productiveness could before yield. For it must not be forgotten, what often is forgotten, where the one ring is, that the productiveness either of land or isn't that sad to think that Henry George never got to read Lord of the Rings? It's a good thing we lucky few have been born in this age. That the productiveness either of land or labor is not to be measured in any one thing, but in all desired things. A settler and his family may raise as much corn on land 100 miles away from the nearest habitation as they could raise were their land in the center of a populous district. But in the populous district they could obtain with the same labor as good a living from much poorer land, or from land of equal quality could make as good a living after paying a high rent, because in the midst of a large population their labor would have become more effective, not perhaps in the production of corn, but in the production of wealth generally, or the obtaining of all the commodities and services which are the real object of their labor. Yes, the object of any man's labor, George would say, is to satisfy their desires. This is his fundamental rule, he says, that everything springs from, that man seeks to gratify their desires with the least amount of exertion. I sort of call this, he doesn't use the term, but it's like the law of incentivization, because that's how most modern economists talk about that kind of idea. George continues, but even where there is a diminution in the productiveness of labor, the official definition of diminution, by the way, is a reduction in size of extent, importance, thing, a permanent diminution in value. That is to say, where the increasing demand for wealth has driven production to a lower point of natural productiveness than the addition to the power of labor from increasing population suffices to make up for it, for it does not follow that the aggregate production as compared with the aggregate labor has been lessened. Let us suppose land of diminishing qualities. The best would naturally be settled first, and as population increased, production would take in the next lower quality, and so on. But as the increase of population, by permitting greater economies, adds to the effectiveness of labor, the cause which brought each quality of land successively into cultivation would at the same time increase the amount of wealth that the same quantity of labor could produce from it. But it would also do more than this. It would increase the power of producing wealth on all the superior lands already in cultivation. Yes, this is a nice, subtle, but important little point. I forgot about this one. If the relations of quantity and quality were such that increasing population added to the effectiveness of labor faster than it compelled a resort to less productive qualities of land, though the margin of cultivation would fall and rent would rise, the minimum return to labor would increase. That is to say, though wages as a proportion would fall, wages as a quantity would rise. The average per yes, this is like if I'm working on a piece of land and I get paid $10 to work it, and then some invention comes along. So I'm making $20 worth of wealth, and my landlord is taking $10 of rent and giving me $10. Okay, an invention comes along, and now this piece of land is actually gone from making $20 of wealth a day for my labor. It's actually making, we'll go crazy, $100 of wealth per day for my labor, and I'm still only paid. Well, I can be, maybe I got a raise. Now I'm getting paid $15 a day. My proportion has gone from 50% of the total produce to 15%, $15 of the 100 being made versus the $10 of the 20. So my proportion has dropped, but I am actually making more. That is to say, though wages as a proportion would fall, wages as a quantity would rise. The the average production of wealth would increase. Yeah, there's 100 units of our dollars of wealth I was saying are now being produced every day from me working this land. The average if the relations were such that the increasing effectiveness of labor just compensated for the diminishing productiveness of the land as it was called into use, the effect of increasing population would be to increase rent by lowering the margin of cultivation. Yes, because if they're equally balanced, that means that the margin of cultivation is now down to like $10, but we're making more. more wealth total. I don't know. I have to think more about the numbers, but I keep talking. Um, Without reducing wages as a quantity, wait, the average production of wealth would increase if the relations were such that the increasing effectiveness of labor just compensated for the diminishing productiveness of the land as it was called into use. The effect of increasing population would be to increase rent by lowering the margin of cultivation with, without reducing wages as a quantity. Uh, right. Okay. Yeah. Lower margin of cultivation. If it goes down to like $10 off a piece of land, then the place that was making 30, yeah, they're gonna get more rent. Um, and if it's perfectly offsetting, then yes, we're still making the same amount in wages. And to increase the average production, yes, that's yeah, okay. I I got myself a little confused, but now I'm back on track. If we now suppose population still increasing, okay, so outpacing the the powers of cooperation, I guess. Um, if we now suppose population still increasing, but between the poorest quality of land in use and the next lower quality, to be a difference so great that the increased power of labor which comes with the increased population that brings it into cultivation cannot compensate for it, the minimum return to labor will be reduced, and with the rise of rents, wages will fall, not only as a proportion but as a quantity. But unless the descent in the quality of land is far more precipitous than we can well imagine, or that I think ever exists, the average production will still be increased, for the increased effectiveness which comes by reason of the increased population that compels resort to the inferior quality of land attaches to all labor, and the gain on the superior qualities of land will more than compensate for the diminished production on the quality last brought in. The aggregate wealth production, as compared with the aggregate expenditure of labor, will be greater, though its distribution will be more unequal. I mean, this is kind of an empirical claim. We could suppose we're all living on an island, and then suppose one woman has quinzillion tuplets, and so in like in 10 years, we've suddenly increased, like there's been a huge increase in population, and maybe we don't know how to really best take advantage of such an increase of population. Like the labor market doesn't know how to really take advantage of that. So I'm concocting this scenario where maybe this is the case, and clearly there's not any more land on that little island. And then yeah, especially if you don't have, like, if you imagine some sort of little island where they didn't have any kind of technology to do anything but do like subsistence farm, like not subsistence, anything to do but like basic farming. They hadn't invented other things, I suppose, in that example. But I mean that's I mean George does concede that there is a point of overpopulation, um, when the Earth is. He argues that technological progress will develop at a point to where really our final only limitation is, will there be enough physical space for all the humans on the Earth? And you can imagine there being a point at which there just literally isn't enough space. Because he makes this, the argument that all these all this matter, at some point, if we master it all, can be converted to any form of matter we want. And so it's kind of interesting. Uh, but he also says that is unimaginably far in the future, and I tend to agree. So George continues. I'm 45 minutes. Do we finish this? Whew, I don't know if we finish this. Maybe I call it there. Well, this is a nice concluding paragraph. Thus, increase of population as it operates to extend production to lower natural levels operates to increase rent and reduce wages as a proportion, and may or may not reduce wages as a quantity, while it seldom can and probably never does reduce the aggregate production of wealth as compared with the aggregate expenditure of labor, but on the contrary increases and frequently largely increases it. All right, that is where I'll end my reading. I will say that so this book is titled Progress and Poverty because that's the starting point that George begins at, which is we observe, and then he was writing in 1879. We observe that everywhere that there's great progress, like in the big cities, like New York and London, alongside it is the sharpest form of poverty. Whereas in newer countries or in newer cities, there is less progress, there's less accumulation of wealth, but there's also less actual poverty. He says early on that San Francisco, where he lived for a time in the 1800s, he's like, is there not just less poverty there because it is less progressed as New York City? And now, of course, it is as progressed or maybe more progressed than New York City, and it has even greater bits of destitution. Um, and then he seeks to find out the fundamental cause of this and where the current political economists have gone wrong. He starts off by defining his terms of what capital, labor, and land are. He makes a very big deal out of land. That's his whole big thing. And he basically says that land is not capital. Capital are things produced by labor. And anything that is land or land-like, so like, when you first think of land, you might think of soil, um, trees, grass, plants, but you would also want to consider land-like assets. A better word some have sort of said is like nature. Um, so you would also include water. George even talks about if we're able to ever come up with something that can utilize the power of the sun. This was, of course, before solar was invented. Wind, the electromagnetic spectrum. Modern Georgists have realized that that is also a land-like asset. And of course, minerals or oil in the earth or anything that you would want to harvest from the earth are also considered land. These are things no one created, no one really has a right to own, and yet society and humanity everywhere these days, at least in modern or in developed nations, allowed basically the first person to claim land, or like in California, water rights were just granted indefinitely to the first person who claimed them, sort of as like a form of like homesteading. And so you basically have a bunch of people who are able to claim Earth, and then you have subsequent generations who do not have the Earth. So I've gotten a little away from my summary. So George defines land, labor, capital, very distinct. These things are mutually exclusive from each other. Although capital comes from labor and is not absolutely it's not clearly not necessary at the start of things that capital was necessary for the production of anything, because there was no capital and yet humanity started producing things. Then he goes and talks about the return to each of these, and defines them as the return to labor is wages, the return to capital is interest, the return to land is rent. And then he deals with the current views of where wages come from. He says they come from the produce of your labor. When you labor, which you require earth to labor on, in, at, with, when you make things from the earth, the produce, that's your natural wages. He says this idea that capital has to be accumulated first and that labor is paid from capital, and so that labor is limited by how much capital currently exists and can be divided between the laborers, is totally false. He says that it is sort of propped up by sort of a view of like Malthus's view of why all these people are starving and dying. George was extremely popular in Ireland for his explanation of like the potato famine and these sorts of and the tyranny of landlordism there. Um, yeah, and I basically view his ideas as like universally applicable to human society when they start allowing landlords to extract high rates of rent. Um, and it's very applicable now to our like housing crisis. 40% of Americans are renters, and there's something wrong with how they have to live as something like uh, wage slaves, as some people call it. Anyway, you're all invited to read this for free. This is where that book can be read for free. Um, you can I have a Substack where I write about this. I am not like a trained economist or theorist. Ooh, I have some notifications. There's also just the Progress and Poverty Substack I would highly recommend. I post all of these daily devotionals where, I'm just reading through Progress and Poverty, which I have read before, but I'm reading back through it. On this channel, Henry George. Oh, how do I get to my home? My channel, the Henry George Daily Devotional. If you're really into Discord, you can join the Georgism Discord. I have this is my own little resource I compiled about Georgism, for Georgist resource. So like this website, I mean this is one of my posts on my blog, but it links to if you want to watch some modern content creators post about a video about Georgism, there's some links to those. There's some podcasts. Where's the Discord? So yes, I guess here's the Discord invite for Discord. It's probably not tactically wise to give you so many different links, but I'm just so excited that you're all here. Here are some of my favorite quotes about Georgism. Karl Marx said, "Theoretically, the man Henry George is utterly backward. He understands nothing about the nature of surplus value." Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, said, "If I were to rewrite the book, I would offer the savage a well, this is kind of spoiler alert. You read this quote on your own time if you don't want Brave New World to be spoiled." Tolstoy uh, says, "I was sick for a week, but consumed." I mean, this is from a letter. He was literally sick. He's consumed by George's latest social problems, which I have not read. I actually intend to continue the Henry George Daily Devotionals after I finish Progress and Poverty to read Social Problems as well as his other book. Uh, the name I forget. And the first book, Progress, which produced a strong and joyous impression on me. This book is wonderful, but it is beyond value, for it destroys all the cobwebs of Spencer and Mill's political economy. It is like the pounding of water, and acutely summons people to a moral consciousness of the cause, and even defines the cause. There is weakness in it, as with anything created by man, but there is genuine humanitarian thought and heart, not scientific trash. I see in him a brother, one of those who, according to the teachings of the books of the apostles, has more love for people than for his own soul." Um, I would say if what's popping up in your mind are sort of um, the modern responses to Georgism, which is like, is land a big deal? Like, come on, look at how our technological age works. I would highly recommend reading the Henry George. I guess I've already closed that. Oh no, I'd highly recommend reading Lars Doucet's articles um, from his. You can go to his book review, or you can go to his website. Uh, he directly addresses this with a bunch of empirical evidence from modern times about how valuable land is. It's pretty related to like the urbanist housing movements, the YIMBY movements. Not just bikes is a favorite YouTube channel of mine. Anyway, here's a another of my favorite Mark Twain quotes. I should put the Einstein quote on here. His quote about George is really nice, and who doesn't like Einstein? Plus, at one point in my life, I studied physics in college, and so I have a special affinity for the physicists. Mark Twain said, "But I know of a mechanical force more powerful than anything the vaunting engineer of Syracuse ever dreamed of. It is the force of land monopoly. It is a screw and lever all in one. It will screw the last penny out of a man's pocket and bend everything on earth to its own despotic will. Give me the private ownership of all the land, and will I move the earth? No, but I will do more. I will undertake to make slaves of all the human beings on the face of it. Not chattel slaves exactly, but slaves nonetheless. What an idiot I would be to make chattel slaves of them. I would have to find them salt and senna when they were sick, and whip them to work when they were lazy." Yes, yes. There's this super nefarious side of of all the modern landlords, where it's like it has this presumed fair trade innocence. Like, oh, I pay them a competitive rate. They wouldn't take the job if they, didn't want to. But that's because there is no land. Like, where's the closest land for me to go work? I, it's the desert. There's nothing to go. I could not. I would die. I would die if I had to go find the nearest piece of land to live off of. Humanity, Max's line would end. All right. Thanks for the raid again, John. Yes, I am making a video game. You guys, I guess, are video game people, whoever's left. It is called Flock of Dogs. You can find that on Steam, and that would mean a lot to me too. But yeah, I care about many things. All right, bye, John. Bye, everybody.